I'm Bill Hohenstein. I'm the director of USDA's Global Change Program Office. We're an office that has actually been around for quite some time. We were formed in 1990 with a mission of integrating climate change into the operations and decision-making of the Department of Agriculture. And it's certainly a work in progress, but it's a work that we're proceeding rapidly on right now. The administration is very concerned about climate change. Our Secretary Vilsack, is very concerned about climate change and is very interested in the role that agriculture can play, both domestically and internationally. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and it's really a pleasure to see the size of this crowd and the interest in agriculture and climate change, because we are living in very interesting times. And I think it's very important that as we move forward both domestically and internationally, that the community that has expertise in agriculture has a seat at the table and is voicing the interests of agriculture and the understanding of agriculture and how agriculture can play a constructive role in both domestic and international policy. I'm going to focus this discussion on the international side. I think the primary interest right now is where we stand in the negotiations moving forward, and the state of play in the discussions leading up to Copenhagen. Clearly, when you look at agriculture, there are sort of three key interests. One is that what I like to say is that agriculture is on the receiving end of climate change, that agriculture within the U.S. is likely to be affected by climate change. In fact, we're already seeing some effects of climate change on agriculture in the U.S. Those effects are more profound internationally, in part because the effects are likely to be greater in some countries, and that the ability to adapt to climate change is much less in most developing countries. And so the effects of climate change are going to be important to deal with in the context of this round of negotiations. Second is that agriculture is part of the problem. There are emissions that come from agriculture within the U.S., within developed countries, but also in developing countries as well. And then finally, we can be part of the solution. There are low-cost opportunities, I think as Ross was saying, to reduce the emissions from agriculture and to increase carbon sequestration. One of the key issues going forward is going to be the role that developed and developing countries play. And there's an increasing interest in ensuring that developing countries can play a constructive role in mitigating the emissions of climate change. And if you look globally, about 2/3 of the emissions come from the energy sector, the focus of much of the discussion on mitigation up till now. About 1/3 come from the land sector, and that is split between agriculture and deforestation. That issue is actually more significant in developing countries. And so if we look to what developing countries can do, what developing countries can bring to the table, especially some key emerging economies, it's going to be important to look at the agricultural sector and the forest sector as sources of mitigation, cost-effective sources of mitigation, sources that can be tapped into by countries as they develop their mitigation strategies. So, for example, within China, about over 20% of the emissions come from the agricultural sector. That's also true in India. And when you look at some of the key forest countries, Brazil, Indonesia, over half of the emissions come from deforestation and land use change. So let me step back for a minute and just describe where we are currently within the international context. And this may be very simplistic for some of you, it may be very valuable for others. There are in fact two agreements, one that's subsidiary to the other. There's the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which virtually all countries are party to, including the United States. And that agreement has commitments. It has non-binding aims to reduce emissions from sources and enhance removals by sinks. Virtually every source, including all the agricultural sources, are included under the Framework on Climate Change, Convention on Climate Change, including agricultural sinks, deforestation, all the agricultural sources of emissions. There's also the Kyoto Protocol, which is party to by virtually every developed country party except the United States and most developing country parties as well. There, the treatment of agriculture and land use is different than for most sources. Sources of emissions from agriculture, including enteric fermentation, emissions from rice paddies, virtually the emissions of methane and nitrous oxide, are treated as any other source of emissions. And so the question of whether agriculture is treated under the Kyoto Protocol in some ways is simple. Yes, the emission sources are captured under the Kyoto Protocol. The sequestration, or the issue of carbon and land use, is more complicated. And for developed countries, they must account for afforestation, reforestation, and deforestation in their terrestrial carbon accounts. They also may account for agricultural soil carbon sequestration, forest management, grazing management, other sources and sinks of carbon. And so there's a dichotomy within the Kyoto Protocol, within the developed country pool, of how agriculture is treated. The emission sources are captured in countries' accounts. The carbon that can either be a source or a sink in agricultural soils is optional. That also holds true with regard to how developing countries play in the Kyoto Protocol currently. The Clean Development Mechanism is the primary mechanism for developing countries to contribute mitigation under the Kyoto Protocol. And currently, the land accounts that are treated under the Clean Development Mechanism include afforestation and reforestation. The agricultural sources, again, methane, nitrous oxide, are included, but not necessarily agricultural sinks. And so you do see agricultural projects under the CDM, but they're primarily methane capture and waste management systems and afforestation projects. Now, moving forward, we are in intensive negotiations leading up to Copenhagen, but we're not necessarily just negotiating one agreement. There are really, in reality, 2 rounds of negotiations occurring simultaneously. The Kyoto Protocol countries are negotiating a second round of commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. The current commitments run through the year 2012. A new round of commitments is being discussed for the Kyoto Protocol countries. All countries, including developed and developing countries, are in intensive negotiations on under another group called a group dealing with long-term cooperative action. And so you'll see in the context of these negotiations, a meeting of which is happening next week, 2 groups. The IWG, or Intergovernmental Intergovernmental Working Group on the Kyoto Protocol, where the Kyoto Protocol discussions are happening, and the IWG on the LCA, or the IWG on long-term cooperative action. And again, it's important to note that the U.S. is not party to the Kyoto Protocol, but party to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and so primarily our interest is in what's happening under the LCA, where there's, again, a dichotomy of discussions, new actions by developed countries and new actions by developing countries. And the U.S. actually just put in a submission under the IWG LCA for what we think the framework should be for that new agreement. And that framework will have essentially 4 parts, dealing with mitigation, where there are comparable actions for all developed countries, commitments by all developed countries. And so the U.S. is basically putting forward a set of commitments that would be comparable to what the Kyoto countries, developed countries, are doing. And actions by all countries, including developing countries, although what the U.S. is saying is those actions need to account for the capacities and capabilities and responsibilities of developing countries. And so we can't simply treat all developing countries the same anymore. The capabilities and responsibilities of China are going to be different than the capabilities and responsibilities of countries in the Congo Basin. And so that's reflected in the U.S. submission as well. There's also a discussion of the importance of adaptation in this new agreement. That's going to be key. Financing is going to be key, and technology is going to be key. And so our submission and the discussions as they move forward are really going to happen on these 4 key elements: mitigation, adaptation, financing, and technology. Now, where does land use fit into that? It fits in under virtually all of those areas. I mean, it's certainly a discussion of mitigation. Much of the focus, at least with regard to developing countries, has been on the issue of deforestation. And that's important to several countries: Papua New Guinea, Costa Rica, others. But in reality, we're discussing more than just deforestation. There's a term that is being flipped around called REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation in developing countries. In actuality, it's REDD+. The language talks about other issues as well: conservation, sustainable forest management, and enhancing forest carbon stocks. Conservation could actually be quite broad and could include soil conservation, it could include agricultural soil conservation, could include grazing land conservation. And so, within the discussions, there is openings for how we would treat agriculture under the LCA as we move forward for developing countries. Now, what are some of the options? Well, when we're talking about the LCA in developing countries, there's a lot of interest in providing offsets. Can developing countries take on actions or develop commitments where they could reduce emissions and potentially be compensated by developed countries for those reductions through a trading system? The interest there is that countries would set up national systems. So a country would basically take on some sort of national program to reduce emissions from deforestation, take on some sort of internal responsibility to or goal to reduce those emissions and assess progress based on that goal. Another option is that countries would allow projects and activities, and so they would allow investment in their countries to reduce emissions, and there would be activities going on within those countries at a project level, but not necessarily under an umbrella of a national system. Both of those options could create offsets that could be used by developed countries to offset their emissions. In addition, I think there's a recognition that not all countries have the capability, have the internal infrastructure, have the policy infrastructure to do that. And so there's going to be a need to actually work with a set of important developing countries, but less developed countries, to improve their capabilities, to begin to take mitigation actions, but not necessarily have those actions be part of an offset market. Now, where does agriculture fits into this? I think it's in the discussion, and I know I've heard from around the room, I've heard many of you come up and talk to me about, is agriculture in? How do we get agriculture into this round of agreement? It's in there, but it's essentially under the radar at this point, and I think it's important to highlight what the potential is for agriculture. I think it's important because as we move forward with key developing countries, agriculture is a key source of emissions. And so I think it's important to recognize that the mitigation potential in countries like China, India, and Brazil are going to be in part in the agricultural sector. I think that's also true for the U.S. We're looking at agriculture as a cost-effective source of emission reductions. It's also important to note that agriculture is a driver of land use change, and to the extent that we're interested in reducing deforestation, we've got to be interested in agriculture's role in that. And then finally, when we look at investments aimed at sequestration, we can be looking at broadly what agriculture can do, and a lot of that is going to be improving the efficiency of agriculture in developing countries, reducing the pressure that agriculture places on land conversion and land use change. And as an example of that, I want to show a little bit of an analysis by a group working on a model called Minicam. Jay Edmonds is a global climate economist, and he's looking at, over the next 100 years, how mitigation could play out globally. He has a land sector in his model, and he's looked at the role that agriculture can play as a driver of deforestation. Now, under his core scenario, with constant agricultural productivity, there's extensive emissions from deforestation over the next century. In fact, 162 petagrams, or 162 billion tons of carbon over the next century. If we improve agricultural productivity and reduce demand for land, reduce the role that agriculture plays in deforestation, only by 0.5% per year, we can reduce those emissions to 11 petagrams. So in essence, eliminate them by 2020. And so this shows the power that agriculture can play as a driver of deforestation and the role that enhancing productivity in developing countries can play in reducing emissions. Now, can we do that? Well, looking at corn yields globally, if you look at the EU and North America, the yields are roughly comparable, maybe a little higher in North America, but significantly lower in most developing countries, in South America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Looking at soybeans, actually, we have quite a different story. We have still much higher yields in the U.S. and the EU, but we see comparable systems in place in Brazil and in Argentina, comparable agricultural systems and comparable productivity. Very different case in China and Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And China in particular is now a significant importer of soybeans, primarily from the U.S., Brazil, and Argentina. And so, enhancing productivity, looking at the role that basically basic research into agriculture, improving the efficiency of agriculture, improving processing and handling and reducing losses can have in improving food supply, improving the availability of land for things like biofuels, and reducing deforestation. And so as we move forward, these kinds of issues aren't necessarily on the agenda in the climate discussions, but as countries move forward and say, what can we do about climate change? What's our profile of emissions, and what are the policies that we can put into place? These kinds of policies are going to be extremely important. So let me close by just with a few points. I mean, it's clear that agriculture is in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it is going to play a central role in these negotiations. The emission sources are definitely in. I think there's definitely work to do with regard to carbon sequestration in soils under the Kyoto Protocol and under the CDM. Agriculture is going to play a key role in the U.S. in our domestic strategy, and it will most likely play a key role in some key developing countries' strategies as well. Finally, looking broadly, stepping back and looking at the role that agricultural productivity plays as a driver of deforestation is going to be important. And it's going to be important for the agricultural community in the U.S. and globally to be at the table, to be understanding what's going on in the negotiations, and to be playing a role.